In this lecture, we'll look at global terrorism and the rise of Osama bin Laden, which led to September 11th. The rise of terrorism in the 20th century means that the conflict has moved away from showdown between established armies and into the realm of violent acts against civilians perpetrated by fringe figures and rogue ideologues. After this lecture, you'll understand the origins of modern terrorism and the conditions that allowed it to spread. Terrorists, in a sense, have existed throughout history, and political assassinations can be seen since antiquity, most famously the assassination of Julius Caesar by his confidant Brutus. Also, you see this in the Ottoman Empire in a standard form of practice. From the Ottoman Empire's history from 1300 up until about 2 centuries, whenever a sultan would ascend the throne, he would immediately have all of his brothers and his brothers' sons strangled. The reason for this was because the Ottoman Empire was a dynasty, and any other brother would have equal claim to the throne. Therefore, in order to eliminate political opposition, a threat to his power, or the threat of a civil war, a brother would do this. But as you can see, in order to kill an elite, you had to be close to them. Brutus was in the imperial senate, so that's how he could help stab Julius Caesar. This was a conspiracy of senators. The person who would kill a sultan's brother in the Ottoman Empire was in the royal court and had access. So a commoner had great difficulty killing an elite. You couldn't really just casually pick up a bow and arrow and try to fire a shot. However, this changes in recent periods of history. With the development of personal explosive devices in the 19th century, such as small handguns and dynamite, large-scale murders were no longer the sole domain of armies. Now it's also available to radical ideologues and marginal groups acting on an individual basis. Anarchists such as these committed a number of high-profile murders in the late 19th and early 20th century, including the assassination of U.S. President William McKinley, Russian Tsar Alexander II, and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which led to World War I. So this is where the violence and terrorism that becomes internationalized comes into the Middle East. This brand of violence spread to the Middle East as well. In the 1940s, members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood attacked British policemen and troops located within Egypt. In the 1970s, paramilitary factions of the PLO seized and eventually executed 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich. You can learn more about this by watching the Steven Spielberg movie Munich, which is quite historically accurate. And George Habash founded the paramilitary splinter group Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which popularized the hijacking of airplanes as a militant tactic. Something interesting about George Habash is that he's a Palestinian Christian. It's a misnomer to think that all Palestinians are Muslims. They aren't. Palestinian is an ethnic identity. There are Palestinian Christians, a small number of Palestinian Jews as well, many of which who are just as fervently against Israel as their Muslim brethren. Now, the number of Palestinian Christians has dwindled. In the city of Bethlehem, which used to have a large Christian presence, it's dwindled to almost nothing. So they as well have been marginalized in their own society, but it's good to point out the diversity that exists within the Palestinian ethnic consciousness. Now let's jump ahead to Osama bin Laden. The most infamous example of modern Middle Eastern terrorism is, without a doubt, Osama bin Laden. In 1988, he founded Al-Qaeda, which means the base in Arabic. He was born to a billionaire construction magnate in Saudi Arabia and part of the richest family outside of the royal family of Saudi Arabia. He studied engineering at the university in Riyadh, and bin Laden used his vast wealth to fund militant Islamic movements such as the Afghani resistance to the Soviet invasion in the 1980s. It's good here to point out that, of course, the U.S. supported the Afghans against the Russian invasion, And another film, if you want to watch to get background about the U.S. political involvement, is Charlie Wilson's War with Tom Hanks. Again, giving good historical data to this. Now, America did support the Afghani resistance militarily, but it didn't directly support Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was a foreign fighter, and the US specifically supported, with armaments and with training, local Afghani fighters. So I just wanted to point that out. During the US-led Gulf War, he was enraged that infidels had inhabited the Muslim Holy Land. This and other events inspired him to rally Muslims to the use of violence as a means of replacing Western-dominated or Western-controlled Muslim countries with Islamic theocracies. So he based himself in Afghanistan and began coordinating terrorist attacks in 1988, with attacks against U.S. embassies based in Africa, killing hundreds. Bin Laden claimed that it was the U.S.-Israeli alliance and the 1982 invasion of Lebanon that pushed him to plan the September 11th attacks. His plans are, of course, well known. 19 Saudi Arabian men hijacked 4 commercial airlines and ran them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing 3,000. Just a couple of notes about bin Laden and his connection to al-Qaeda to give a little bit more background about his leadership structure. There have been a few Western journalists who had a chance to interview him before he was killed in 2011 by SEAL Team 6. They described him as shy and fairly timid. Interestingly enough, this is a good way to describe his leadership style and how he ran al-Qaeda. If we think about this in terms of business terminology, al-Qaeda was less of a trading business and more of a venture capital firm in the run-up to 9/11. This means that rather being what one would think of as an army, with a clearly defined hierarchy, support structure, funding, means of supplying troops, provisioning, and a command hierarchy where there was a general on top who could issue orders that would quickly filter out through the military body. Well, it wasn't like this. Instead of al-Qaeda being like this, of a trading business, it was more of a venture capital firm, meaning that it provided limited funds, logistics, and support for other people's operations. However, al-Qaeda, after 9/11, when it became notorious throughout the West and also well known throughout the Middle East, and to those in the Middle East who might be sympathetic to its goals, became quite sympathetic to their aims. It became like a franchise brand with individual regional groups fighting local wars, but they would publicly affiliate themselves with al-Qaeda. Think of it as a franchise where another business might pop up and not pay franchise fees, but still call themselves al-Qaeda, so they can confer upon themselves all the benefits and all the reputation and legitimacy that comes with this organization. So to imagine it as a clearly defined command structure in which Osama bin Laden is the general is a bit mistaken. He was a lot more behind the scenes and can be thought of more of as a chairman of the board rather than a CEO. However, many of the actual tactical operations of al-Qaeda were handled by subordinates like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and al-Zawahiri, not him directly, particularly when he goes into hiding and when he's finally found and killed in 2011. He's in an apartment building in Pakistan, and the only way he can communicate with subordinates is to put information on flash drives and have it hand-delivered, since communicating over email and the internet would make his location very easy to find. Well, after his death, the story isn't over. Since 2001, there have been 18,000 reported terrorist attacks around the world perpetrated by Muslims. In defense of those who've done this, they, or those sympathetic to them, have claimed that Western imperialism was a form of terrorism in their own lives. So despite his death, unfortunately, these attacks continue. We are now in an era and a deadly new chapter where warfare has moved away largely from the World War I, World War II, Cold War era concept of massive armies fighting one another to small groups held together by marginal ideologies and fanaticism in engaging guerrilla warfare and with asymmetrical warfare, in which you do have a large, well-established army like the United States, fighting against small guerrilla bands who execute tactical surgical strikes. So unfortunately, it's a very new and very deadly era in the 20th century that we're experiencing. Another era that's very important when we talk about the Middle East is, of course, the Arab Spring, and we're still living through the fallout of it today, which we will discuss in the next lecture. Thanks for listening.